Welcome to our episode of Biblical Archaeology from the Ground Down. Sponsored by Bible Interact and hosted by Dr. George Sparks. Now let's explore the field of archaeology in today's episode.
Well, welcome everybody to another episode of Biblical Archaeology from the Ground Down, sponsored by Bible Interact. Our special guest today is Dr. Tom Schmidt. We have a very interesting program dealing with part of the book of Josephus. It's called the Testimonium Flavium, and we're going to go into some detail about it. But I would say that in reading his book, I was surprised myself because I thought I already knew the answer going into it and completely changed my mind. It is a ground changer. I believe in the historicity of Jesus, referring to this part in the book of Josephus. So let me get into an introduction, folks. The Testimonium Flavium is a controversial passage in the works of the Roman Jewish historian Josephus, written in the late 1st century CE, that mentions Jesus, describing him as a wise man, a miracle worker, and the Christ. But scholars widely agree it's been significantly altered by Christian scribes, likely interpolated pro-Christian claims like resurrection and messianic status. While some believe it's a complete forgery, some scholars in a consensus points to a genuine core, making it a challenging source for the historicity of Jesus, though still considered the earliest non-Christian reference to Jesus. It's a very interesting part in the book of Josephus. Hey, there's a new book from the Oxford University Press, which reasons these passages from Josephus, by Josephus, are essentially authentic. So as some scholars make a consensus saying that, it was a later Christian editor's involvement, things might change here. Today, our special guest, once again, is Dr. Thomas Schmidt, graduate of Yale University, where he earned his PhD, author of this very amazing book titled Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dr. Sparks. It's wonderful to be here.
Good to have you with us.
There's just so many questions that we could actually ask. But going into it, I would say, number one, if you would paint a picture of who Josephus is for our audience and his importance for the historical Jesus, if you would.
Josephus is one of our most important sources to understand early Judaism in the 1st century and to understand the background of the New Testament. He was born in 37 AD. He was born to a priestly family. His father was a priest in the Jewish temple. He was also born to this same family who was descended from kings. So he came from both priestly and royal descent. He was an aristocrat. And he was raised in Jerusalem in 37 AD. And there, when he was about 19 years old, he became a Pharisee. And then at about age 20, he would have become a priest. We know he became a priest. He tells us that in his own words. He started serving in the Jewish temple. And at age 25, he was appointed to be a diplomat, where he met with the Empress of Rome. And then shortly after that, the war between the Jewish people and Rome began. This is about 67, 68 AD. And he was appointed a general. It was an extremely high position in the Jewish military. And there was only about 7 generals and then 1 or 2 supreme commanders. And he was one of the generals. Josephus served in Galilee. And then after the Jews were defeated by the Romans, after the temple was destroyed and Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, Josephus managed to get to know the Roman emperor. He actually was captured by the Romans during the war and became sort of an asylum figure that the Roman emperor used him as a translator to try and mediate the conflict. And so he survived and he settled in Rome, where he devoted the remaining years of his life to writing the history of the Jewish people. And he wrote almost 500,000 words that we have preserved. He wrote 4 different books that we can talk about.
Well, perhaps, Tom, you could give us a bit of a survey of some of the writings of Josephus. Our audience might not be familiar with the number of volumes and how they are distinct from one another, and just a real quick survey just to give them a little
Yes.
taste of that. And
Yes. Josephus, he's known as a historian, and
right,
he wrote his first book around 75 AD, and it was a history of the wars of the Jews, the Jewish war, I shouldn't say wars, the Jewish war, singular, with Rome. And of course, he's an eyewitness to the war and was a
right,
general in the war, so he knows a lot about it. And he writes this, and then that has a little bit of background, but it mostly covers the years 66 to 70 AD. And then in a sequel, he writes The Antiquities of the Jews, and that is in 20 books, and it goes from creation all the way up to about 66 AD. You put both of those books together, and he covers all of Jewish history up to about 74 or so AD. He has two other books, though. He has an autobiography where he talks about his life, and this really is more of a defense of him as a general. I wish he said more about his life before the Jewish War and more about his life after the Jewish War, but most of it is about what he did during the Jewish War. He
right.
was getting some accusations of misconduct, so he was defending himself. And then the fourth book, is a defense of Judaism, and it's titled Against Appian. It's in two books, two sections, and it's a defense of Judaism. And it's marvelous to read. You know, you read it now and you realize that many of his arguments for Judaism were taken up by later Christian writers to defend Christianity. And you see echoes of things of that today. And in it is a treasure trove of quotations from ancient writers about Jews and Judaism. And many of these quotations we don't have anywhere else. And we would have lost if not for Josephus. So
Yeah,
it's extremely, extremely valuable for us. It's one of those things where Josephus wrote so much, but you wish he wrote more.
yeah. And from my research on reading him, when you read the book of Revelation beside Josephus, it's surprising of how parallel book of Revelation is with many of the things that are described by Josephus. So he becomes a pretty good commentary for a lot of the passages. If it sounds a little bit far-fetched, read a little Josephus and you'll see grounded and rooted in the first century in a lot of respects. So the destruction of Jerusalem. So he's well worth the read, and he's good stuff. So
Precisely.
thanks very much, Tom, for your research on that.
But in these books, he tells us so much about Jewish culture, happenings. He talks about events and names and places that the New Testament references as well. If you read his books, you'll see all these people whom you recognize in the story of the Gospels or in the book of Acts. People like Pontius Pilate and Herod Agrippa and Herod the Great and Salome, Herodias, the mother of the girl who dances for the head of John the Baptist. And Josephus even talks about John the Baptist. He talks about James, the brother of Jesus. And of course, he also talks about Jesus. And what he has to say is very controversial. And that's what my book is about.
Wow.
Oh,
So
that was
really,
quick.
we have a first century eyewitness account outside of the Gospels of Jesus and the Jesus people in Galilee at that time and in Israel. So that's pretty amazing, and why we all seem to gravitate to Josephus when we want to know what's happening in that time period.
Well, David, you know what else is amazing? That this book is free, and we're going to put up some information how people can actually obtain this book. It is remarkable. You need to get it and read it.
Hmm.
You know what you just told me, Doctor? You just actually told me that Josephus was hobnobbing with the high class, the aristocrats, and at the same time was in the vicinity where Jesus would have been, possibly if it's up north in Galilee. He has his ministry. If he goes down in Jerusalem and gets in trouble, with the Pharisees, he's somehow, if he isn't involved there at a younger age, he definitely would know those like Annas, the high priest, and Caiaphas. He's
Mhm.
hobnobbing with the elitists. I think in your book, did you call him Josephus refers to him as metaphorically the one, the number one, or something like that, at the first, something like that?
Yes, yes. So Josephus, though not an eyewitness himself to Jesus, he was an eyewitness to people who knew Jesus.
Right.
Okay.
And he was born in 37, so a few years after Jesus had been crucified. But George, you're right that he was both an aristocrat, so he's hobnobbing with people who were associated with the trial of Jesus or with opposition to Jesus, and we can get into names and figures in a moment, but he
Yeah.
also was stationed in Galilee as a general,
Mm,
and there he tells us that he visited or even was stationed at places like Cana in Galilee. Cana is just a few miles down the road from Nazareth.
mm,
He also was stationed in Sepphoris. Again, it's a few miles down the road from Nazareth. I mean, it's very obvious that Josephus would have been around Galileans who had met Jesus and knew Jesus, the lower classes, the middle classes, of what few middle classes there were at the time. He would have associated with these people. And that's aside from all of the illustrious figures that he knew in Jerusalem. And we can just go through the list of kinds of people he would have known. He had intimate connections with the royal Jewish family, the Herodian dynasty. He knew the leader of the Sanhedrin. He knew high priests. He knew chief priests. He knew the leader of the Pharisees. He was a Pharisee. I mean, he knew all of these people. And clearly, some of these people would have been around when Jesus was ministering. Josephus actually tells us that it was the first men. So, in his account of Jesus, he says, the first men among us accused
First man, yes,
Jesus
yes.
before Pontius Pilate. And that's curious. He uses that phrase, the first men, the protoi. And later on, one of the books that Josephus wrote was an autobiography. And in it, he talks about his life, where he lived, where he's from, his family, what he did. And he tells us that in 51 or 52 AD, he says that I began continually meeting with the first men.
mm,
And
Wow.
we know that he's not exaggerating, because we know that his father was friends with one of the high priests. We know that his father was descended from high priests, his family descended from kings as well. He was a very high-ranking aristocrat, not just a regular aristocrat, but quite a high-ranking one. So he clearly was well positioned to have met these people. And in my book, what I try to do in part two of my book is trace out, I do some rudimentary social network analysis where I try to ask the question, who actually did Josephus know? Can we put a name to some of the people he knew who in turn would have known Jesus? And I think we can. I think there's several good candidates for that. And what this does is it shows that Josephus was remarkably well placed to tell us about Jesus of Nazareth. He wasn't, a Roman historian writing 1,000 miles away in Greece or in the city of Rome. He's a Jewish historian raised in Jerusalem who knew people associated not only with Jesus, but associated with those who accuse Jesus. He even knows people,
Yeah.
I believe, who actually accused Jesus and attended the trial of Jesus.
mm. So he'd have the
Wow.
inside scoop sort of on what's happening, which is pretty amazing. And hobnobbing with those aristocrats, he would
Well,
have they've heard
what your
stories.
what your book helped me to do is it paints, I said, paint a picture, because for me, you're also painting a picture of an environment. Let's say that if I go to Jerusalem and I go to what is called the Wall Museum, you go down a level and here's all the ruins of the elitist houses. And
Mhm.
now I can think of maybe Annas and Caiaphas, and their involvement with the trial, their involvement with Jesus, and that here's this Josephus that actually would have known these people maybe at a later age, like you're saying. But also, it could be the same people that are involved with much later the death of James. So, wow, this is getting pretty amazing already, and we're just getting started.
Absolutely. And I should say that Josephus actually mentions Jesus twice. We said in the beginning, one of us said in the beginning, that he's the first non-Christian to talk
Yes,
about
yes, yes,
Jesus,
yes.
and that's true. And he speaks about Jesus in a paragraph where he talks about the governorship of Pontius Pilate. But later on in one of his books, when he speaks about what was happening shortly before the Jewish war with Rome began, around 62 AD, he mentions James, the brother of Jesus.
Oh, yeah.
And
Wow,
he
yes.
talks about how he was executed illegally by a high priest named Annas the high priest. And so that tells us a number of things. I mean, it tells us that James was an extremely active Christian in 62 AD in Jerusalem, so much so that he attracted the attentions of the high priest who had him executed. And it tells us that, well, Josephus is an adult, at this point. He's 25 years old, 26 years old. He's already served as a diplomat to meet the empress herself in Rome. And he's a Pharisee, he's a high-ranking priest, so he would have known all about this kind of uproar that happened over James, the brother of Jesus. Josephus tells us that because the high priest illegally gathered the Sanhedrin and illegally executed James, that the Roman governor and the king had Annas the high priest removed from the high priesthood. So it was quite a scandal that this caused. It wasn't, sometimes people like to brush this off as if, perhaps this high priest was sort of like a mob boss ordering hits, and this was just one of the many people he happened to. But no, this was a really big deal where the high priest lost his high priesthood because of what he did to James. And what that means is that Josephus would have known all about this. He would have been apprised of this. I mean, imagine if we take an American example, if the president was accused of something terrible, all the senators would know all about this. They would know all about it. There's only 100 of them. They would know about it. They would have inside information. That's the location that Josephus was in. He was in Congress, whether it's the House of Representatives or Senate. He would have known quite a bit.
Now, how does Tom? How does the secular scholars kind of approach Josephus and these kinds of references? Their take on it, and why this is sort of so controversial? Because we all read Josephus, but I can recall, scholars saying for years that all this stuff was sort of made up and interjected and edited and so on and so forth. But you've done quite a bit of research in this area and helped to clarify some of this.
You're right. These two references, scholars have been very suspicious of the first and longer discussion of Jesus. For the second mention of Jesus, scholars are much more positive about it. In fact, I would say the vast majority of scholars accept the authenticity of the second reference to Jesus made by Josephus. This is the one involving James and James's illegal execution. The first reference, which is the longer one, has incurred much more suspicion and doubt. And I agreed with that when I started writing my book. The reasons why scholars were suspicious over the authenticity of the first passage is there's a number of reasons. One is that the language scholars would claim appeared to be non-Josephine. That means that it was written in a style that didn't feel like the style of Josephus. We have a very large sample size of Josephus's writings. We know how he writes, and some people claim there were some phrases that stuck out. A second reason, and this was the big one, was that the claims of the passage, regardless of style, the claims of the passage were far too pro-Christian. They were far too positive about Jesus. They were something that no Jewish non-Christian would ever have said. And this is because, as the passage is normally interpreted by scholars, Josephus says that Jesus was a wise man, that he worked miracles, that he taught the truth, that he was the Christ, that he was crucified at the behest of the first men, Jewish leaders, and that 3 days later he was raised from the dead in fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. You can see why a non-Christian would be unlikely to say that. In fact, if you're a Jew and you say Jesus is the Christ and he was raised from the dead, that makes you a Christian. It makes you a Jewish Christian.
Right.
And so scholars thought, look, a Christian scribe must have gone in here and changed something. Some ancient or medieval scribe changed this. And typically, if you look at the history of scholarship, about 100 years ago, even more than 100 years ago, scholars were fairly united that the whole passage had been inserted whole cloth by an unscrupulous Christian scribe, that nothing in the passage was said by Josephus. But there was a famous and erudite scholar named Henry Thackeray. He was one of the English translators of Josephus in the Loeb Classical Library, those fabulous little green volumes with Greek on one side and English on the other.
We all use those ones, yeah. It's
Yes, I know. Where would we be? Where would we be without those? They're amazing.
Loeb, yeah, it's a standard, every scholar, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Henry Thackeray was so intent on doing a good job that he started making a dictionary or a thesaurus of Josephus's vocabulary because he wanted to understand how Josephus used words and what they meant. And he noticed that there were so many words and turns of phrase in that larger paragraph about Jesus that Josephus also uses elsewhere that were very distinctive, that Henry Thackeray wrote this. He gave a lecture that was then published where he said, you know, I used to think that this was a wholesale forgery, but it's impossible to maintain that now, that the words and phrases that Josephus uses are all over this paragraph. So he changed the course of the field where scholars started thinking, actually, instead of it being a wholesale forgery, we think Josephus wrote something very much like what is in the paragraph, except it's been tweaked, it's been doctored. There's been some subtle changes that were made that had significant impacts to make things more positive. That's what I believed when I started writing my book. And I set out to try and see if we could identify these changes. And I had various ideas of how we'd be able to do that. But what I started doing was using contemporary computer databases. Whereas Henry Thackeray had to do everything by hand. Everything was manual. I mean, he's literally word counting and trying, and that is exhausting, and it's impossible to do a great job just by reading 500,000 words on your own. But when you
Right.
enter all those words into a database and you can do
Yes.
systematic,
Okay.
comprehensive searches, I started using these databases of Josephus's work, and I was astonished that Henry Thackeray had missed a lot of material. In fact, by the end of the day, I say in my book that every single phrase in the Testimonium Flavianum, the Testimonium Flavianum is the name we have for that paragraph about Jesus.
Right.
Every single phrase can be indexed back to Josephus elsewhere in his catalog of works. Again and again and again, the names, the turns of phrase, sentence structures, they all come back to Josephus. And remarkably, those phrases that seem so positive, actually, in the light of how Josephus uses those same phrases elsewhere, they're not as positive. They're ambiguous. Occasionally, they're slightly negative. What that means is those two main arguments for why Josephus could not have written the Testimonium Flavianum. One is the style is different. The other is the claims are too Christian. None of those stand. The style is exactly Josephine, and the claims aren't too Christian. They actually, in the context of Josephus's writings, sound very much like what a first century non-Christian Jew would have said about
There you go.
Jesus.
Yeah. Very
And I
interesting.
understand that you've done some analysis of some of the language, showing that it's probably more maybe ambiguous or not so sort of pro-Christian as some have suggested it is.
Precisely.
Kudos to your research in that area. It's pretty groundbreaking. And
Precisely. And I can give some examples. You know, I mentioned that how Josephus says Jesus worked miracles.
right.
And there's some things I point out in my book. Number one, it actually is very, very common for early non-Christians to say that Jesus worked miracles. We get this in pagan and Jewish sources outside of Josephus. And it's not just common, it's the rule. That's what they all say before the year 300. Secondly, the Greek word that Josephus uses, Greek is a vocabulary-rich language. It has many words for miracles. And the word that Josephus uses is paradoxa. And this is not the most positive word for miracle. A good English translation would be something like paranormal things, things that are supernatural, but we're not quite sure where they're coming from. It's not unambiguously positive necessarily. And Josephus uses this same word to describe the miracles wrought by the magicians of Pharaoh in using their dark arts when they were in that contest with Moses in the book of Exodus. So this, far from being a pro-Christian insertion, looks like something Josephus would have said, and it's not nearly as positive as you would think. And we could go down the list. You know, he says Jesus was a wise man. Well, you know, a lot of non-Christians said Jesus was a wise man, even very hostile sources. And that's because the Greek word sophos for wise man It can mean wise man like what we mean, like someone filled with wisdom, but it can also just mean, a philosopher, a teacher, a pagan philosopher, just a neutral term that doesn't have necessary connotations of someone being profoundly wise.
Yeah.
And that's how it's used in the ancient world. So he might have been complimenting Jesus with that, but he also could have just been, saying he was a teacher. And I show in every case that we either are misinterpreting it, or I show that in one instance where Josephus calls Jesus the Christ, or he apparently says he was the Christ, that this is the one location where I think something important has been lost in the Greek manuscripts,
Mm.
because we have an ancient Latin translation and we have an ancient Syriac translation. Syriac is an Eastern language.
Mhm.
We have translations of this paragraph about Jesus, and both the Latin and the Syriac don't say that Jesus was the Christ. Instead, the Latin says he was believed to be the Christ, and the Syriac says he was thought to be the Christ. And curiously, in that second reference to Jesus that Josephus makes, he also doesn't say Jesus was the Christ. He says he was called the Christ. And so what it looks like is that something has dropped out there, but the Syriac and the Latin preserve it. And so that's the one modification I would make, but I would hasten to add that this is just regular textual criticism. This is what scholars do. We gather all the
Right.
textual witnesses, the translations, the quotations, the manuscripts, and we see what the original was, and that's what I'm doing here. But you put it all together, and the whole paragraph looks totally Josephine. There's nothing about it that is suspicious.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
through a translation, interpretations of a Greek translation, it'd be as if, I'm just saying this in my mind, as if a couple of us went to go see a televangelist and somebody said, Hallelujah, it's a miracle, it's a miracle. And then somebody else that's more questionable might say, that might be hocus pocus. I don't
Yes,
know,
yes.
but
So we do have similar ambiguities in English. If I say that was incredible,
mhm,
am I meaning that's something so amazing and astonishing, or do I mean, well, it's beyond credibility. It's not
mhm,
believable. And I think that the connotation with paradoxa is about the source of the power that Jesus was exhibiting. That is this divine origin? Is it malevolent origin? Is it human origin? And keeping in mind that in the ancient world, humans could do superhuman things sometimes. So the skepticism and the ambiguity is more about where Jesus is getting this power from. And that is different from being suspicious about whether he was just doing, parlor tricks. It's more of like there's also adding to this a shock, a surprise at what's going on.
Mm.
Again, it's like the works that the magicians of Pharaoh did, where they're
there you
apparently
go. Yeah.
supernatural. But Josephus, a good first century Jew wouldn't think that those were good things to be doing.
So you would say then that the passages in Josephus are original. They're not tampered with, although they may have lost something in translation over the years. Is that, do I understand that correctly?
Yes, when you ask, has the passage as it exists in Greek manuscripts of Josephus's works, has that been tampered with? I would say, well, there is this one significant location where a couple words may have dropped out, whether that was intentional or not. There's some evidence for arguing that it was not intentional, which I could explain. However, we have more evidence than just the Greek manuscripts. We have quotations and we have translations, ancient quotations and ancient translations. And when you gather all those together, they together they all preserve the authentic text. And in
Yes.
that sense, the passage hasn't been tampered with. We have the complete passage, and that's what I do in my book. Is I give a translation of this complete text, and I try to, in my translation, moderate the sort of overly positive translations that have been done of this passage in the past, to show that there's more ambiguity here that Josephus is delivering, about Jesus. It's not this, unalloyed positivism.
So we
Okay.
can rely on Thackeray for a good translation, and we can rely on for the historical accuracy from his perspective, at least, the first century eyewitness account of what Jerusalem looks like and what was going on and the higher echelons and so on. So why we all read him, why we all rely on him. I think I used Josephus heavily in my I have an archaeological study Bible that I've just released, and I reference Josephus an awful lot in the book of Revelation and in especially Matthew and the Gospels. So we do rely on him.
Paul is standing in trial before Herod Agrippa II. Herod Agrippa says, are you in such a short time going to convince me to become a Christian? And again,
Yes,
it's
yeah.
coming from a non-Christian. It could be negative. Certainly, it's not necessarily positive, but it's coming from a non-Christian. And then the final reference, I believe, is in First Peter, where Peter says, if you suffer for the name of Christian, do not be ashamed of this.
Yes.
And this is Peter seeming to allude to the fact that people were mocked for having the name Christian. And Peter is saying, that's okay. You can take that name and not be ashamed. And we notice this, in early Christian writings. I mean, there's an early apologist who mentions how he says that, he writes to someone who's a non-Christian, and he says, as for you laughing and calling me Christian, as if it was an insult. But, in one of the greatest, reversals of all time, Christians embraced this name and started using it positively for a self-designation. And Josephus, though, in deploying the term Christian, what's interesting is that this is not something we would expect a first century Christian to use that name necessarily, but we would expect a non-Christian to use that name, and Josephus does. We would also expect that a non-Christian would have to kind of explain the term. It was an unfamiliar term to people, and Josephus does. He explains where the term comes from. Tacitus does the same thing when he talks about Christians as well. So
Yep.
it's one of those many, many notes of authenticity in the Testimonium Flavianum. They're all hidden away and buried in there, and some of them I think are gotchas, where they really show Josephus wrote it, and others are like this one, where this fits pretty nicely with what we would think a first century Jew would have said.
Right, right. So he's not speaking out of context, his cultural context. It fits right in there and
Exactly.
quite natural. It's really astute of you, George, to pick that up.
But also, let's say the earlier and later manuscripts that would mention the testimonium. You mentioned different, like the Latin, the Arabic, the Syriac, but also time sequences. When was it brought up? Like, was it Eusebius of Caesarea? Is that
Yes,
it?
that's a great
313, and
question.
then you got another one in like nine. That's a reverse, like 393, and then again in the 700s, and then later on we have the medieval period, like the 10th, 11th, and 12th century.
Mhm.
Now, when you looked at that, I'm sure you examined all those. My question, in what date do you think there would have been, you said a subtle change, right? Subtle change somewhere, maybe one or two words. When do you think that might have happened?
Another good question. When you look at the manuscript or the textual tradition of the paragraph, when we look at the books of the antiquities, that's the title of the work that this paragraph is found in, Josephus's Antiquities. And you look at the manuscripts we have of this is an enormous work. It's 300,000 words long. If it was printed today, it would be, like 900 pages long. And the manuscripts for this, the earliest are from about the 10th or 11th century. That feels late to most people. That's about 1,000 years removed from when Josephus wrote. That is normal when it comes to ancient authors. That's not anything particularly late as far as our manuscripts go for ancient authors. But that is not the whole story. We do have other quotations that are made by other authors of the passage, and these authors are earlier. We also have excerpts. Excerpts are when instead of having the whole 300,000 words of the Antiquities written down, you have a scribe just writing the paragraph, the testimonium down itself. We also have translations that were made as well. And the earliest quotation that we have is from Eusebius of Caesarea. He was a Christian historian writing around the year 312, 311, somewhere around there. And he quotes the passage. He's writing in Greek. And the earliest, he actually quotes the passage in three different works of his. The first in 312, the others in the 320s. And the earliest manuscript that we have of Eusebius, so he's writing in 311, 312, but then the earliest manuscript we have of Eusebius is from the year 411. And that is extraordinary. That manuscript, it's a Syriac translation of the Greek of Eusebius, and it is the earliest precisely dated literary manuscript in the world. We do have earlier manuscripts, but they either don't have dates, or if they do have dates, they're not literary. They're like tax receipts and bills of sale and wills and things like that. And so the fact that we have the Testimonium Flavianum preserved in a manuscript from 411 AD is extraordinary. You almost can't get better than that by some measures. And we do have this quotation. It's from Eusebius from 311, and then the manuscript from 411. In Eusebius's quotation, those words, thought to be the Christ or was believed to be the Christ, those words are missing already in that quotation. And they are, instead it just says he was Christ or he was the Christ. Now, this means that that omission must have happened either before 311, but after Josephus wrote. So there's about a 220 year period where it could have happened, between 93 AD and 311. However, what's interesting is that the changed phrase, so it's changed from, was thought to be the Christ to was the Christ. In English, this feels like a confession of faith. If you say Jesus was the Christ, it feels like a confession of faith. In Greek, it's not so clear. And they're for two reasons. One is that in Greek loves the definite article. It puts the definite article is just the word the. So, the ball, the rock, the is the definite article. Greek puts that before lots of things. It puts it before proper names. So I would be the Tom or, the Schmidt or something. And in Greek. And so in Greek, the term he was the Christ, that phrase is much more easy to read it as an alternative name for Jesus and not a confession of faith. It's much more easy in Greek to read that as Christ just being an alternative name. And people say that today, Jesus Christ, and they use Christ as a name instead of a religious title. And so that's one possibility. You'd think if they, were to change things around, they would have made it a little more clear that this is a confession of faith. So that suggests that perhaps this was just an accidental omission. The second reason is that think about what Christians say. Christians don't say Jesus was the Christ or Jesus was the Messiah. They say Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Christ. One of the most important aspects of Christian faith is that Jesus did not die on the cross and stay dead. He died and then rose again and is still alive. And this is a vital, vital point. And one of the things I did in my database searches is I tried to look for examples of ancient Christians using the phrase, Jesus was the Christ, or he was the Christ, instead of he is the Christ. And I couldn't find any. There's a database called the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae database. It covers millions and millions of words of Greek. Their goal is to have the entire corpus of Greek literature up to the year 1500 in the database. And they're pretty close to doing that. And I could not find a single example of an ancient Christian using that kind of phraseology. They always say, is the Christ. Jesus is the Christ, because otherwise it suggests that Jesus was dead, that he's dead now. He's no longer around. And the closest I could come is some instances where they would be talking about, the Christians would be talking about the Old Testament, and they would talk about, the rock in Exodus, and they would, Paul the Apostle says the rock was Christ. But it's never Jesus was the Christ or he was the Christ. It's explaining a past phenomenon, the rock, and how that rock was Christ. Of course, the rock doesn't exist anymore. but he was the Christ, Jesus was the Christ, is never used as far as I could tell. And so to me, that suggests that that phrase, that altered phrase, I I think there's a pretty good argument that it was not altered intentionally,
Well,
because it just seems like they would say is the Christ. Jesus is the Christ, or is Christ, meaning that he is this messianic figure. And the scribe didn't do that. And not only that, we have many examples of Christians reading the altered phrase as seemingly just another name for Jesus. They're not reading it as a confession of faith. So if someone was going to make that change, you'd think they would have done a better job. So there's a good argument that it just dropped out accidentally and some point in the first 200 years of transmission, but that the Latin and the Syriac translators, they had manuscripts where the phrase was unchanged. They had the original phrase. And one of them translated it as was believed to be the Christ, and the other translated it as was thought to be the Christ.
wow.
George, do you have any other questions
Yeah,
for
yes. Like I said, David had his questions. I had mine, and I'm only on page 3. Yes, I believe I'll have to paraphrase on this one because I believe didn't Josephus referring to Jesus's ministry as he brought over many Jews and Greeks?
Yes, he does. He says that.
And wouldn't that be odd to mention? Yeah, Jews, of course, but even at that, Jews and Greeks.
Hmm.
Would that
Yes.
be something that would say, hey, that sounds suspicious to me?
Yes, it is odd. If you read the gospel accounts, Jesus's ministry was to Jews. You know, he says to the Syrophoenician woman, I came only for the lost sheep of the tribe of Israel. And then after, at his resurrection, he sends the apostles out to the nations. And we see this in the book of Acts. So it is odd. It causes you to kind of reread some passages in the Gospels. And, you know, you do see Jesus does minister to non-Jews at
Mhm.
times. There are some Greeks in particular that try to see him in the Gospel of John, but it's unclear if they actually ever do. But clearly, though, the focus of his ministry was to Jews. So scholars have wondered about this. The problem, though, with thinking that a Christian must have inserted this is that Christians don't seem to have said, early Christians before the year 300 or so, don't seem to have said that Jesus attracted a lot of Greeks. And this is also in contradiction to the Gospels, which appear to say explicitly he didn't attract a lot of Gentiles, he attracted Jews. So to think of this as an interpolation is odd for a Christian to make.
Mhm.
Instead, if you read early Jewish sources on Jesus, there's a biography, a very hostile biography of Jesus called the Toldoth Yeshu. It's a Jewish biography of Jesus. And it wasn't really codified in the form we have it today until the 6th or 7th century. But we know scholars are very sure that there's traditions in this biography that go back to the 2nd century or even earlier. And in this biography, uh, there's a claim that Jesus did attract all these Gentiles to his ministry. And there's also a phrase, you know, the high priest or the chief priests in the Gospel of John, they say, you know, look, the world has gone after Jesus.
Yes.
And so it seems like the claim that Jesus attracted a lot of Gentiles was an insult to Jesus from a Jewish perspective, and that this was made by early Jews against Jesus, and that Josephus believes this and thinks that it was true. He could have been helped by the fact both that in his time, in the 80s and 90s, there actually were a lot of Gentiles becoming Christian at this time. And it also would have helped him that Jesus, he did minister to Gentiles. I mean, it wasn't as if he never did that. It just, which was extraordinarily unusual for a Jewish rabbi in Palestine to do. He did do that. It just wasn't the focus of his ministry. So I don't think that I think the phrase is fascinating, but I don't think it's suspicious in terms of authenticity. I think it's just one of those other hallmarks that, when properly read, suggests Jewish authorship, not Christian authorship, and gives us an insight into what early Jews thought about Jesus.
That's interesting. It brought to my mind the epic events in the gospel where Jesus ministers to the multitude and feeds them. So he goes over to the west side of the Sea of Galilee and he feeds the people, and there's 12 baskets. And some will say, oh, that symbolizes the 12 tribes. Yes, but he also goes to the east side and they refer to it as the Decapolis. It's Gentile. And there it says that they brought how many baskets? Remember, he even tells his disciples, how
7,
many
right?
baskets? And they
Isn't it
say
7?
seven. Well, in Joshua, the beginning of Joshua, they are supposed to chase out 7 Canaanite tribes out of Canaan. And I'm thinking, is one meant for the Jews and one meant for the Gentiles? That he is Messiah, he is Lord for both Jew and Gentile. Maybe that's what the feeding of the multitudes is about. And when I read that, he brought many Jews and Gentiles. That's the passage in the gospel that kind of rung in my ears. Like, wow, maybe that's what the 12 and the 7 are all about. I don't know. It's just a thought.
George, I confess I didn't know that about the feeding of the 4,000, I think it is, with the 7
There's a
baskets.
7
I
baskets. Yeah.
I am going to write that down. If I think that's a great point, because if that was amongst the Decapolis, presumably there would have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of
Mhm.
Gentiles that were there, and the accusation against Jesus that he was consorting with the Gentiles and attracting Gentiles would have had a lot of basis in reality, that he was doing that. So that's fascinating. I'll note that down. I'm hoping to do a
Mhm.
second edition, and if not a second edition of the book, then a follow-up article or something. And this is something that I would hope to include.
All right, great.
Well, so my
Good.
next question was, what research are you working on now, and and what's to come? This has been such a great contribution. We're wanting more, Tom. Anything in the works? So you
I
see,
have I have much going on. Of course, I'm working on what I hope will end up being a second edition. I don't know if the publisher will let me, but I'm working on that. I have a follow-up article doing some more comprehensive stylistic analysis that I'm hoping to have come out. I'm also hoping to draw further connections between Josephus and Jesus via some of his social network that I omitted in the book.
okay,
Uh, and I also have further research on all sorts of things outside of the historical Jesus.
good.
I'm also a scholar of early Christianity, so I have some translations I'm working on from early Christian writers. And I also am working on the history of Christianity in the East. That's a third area I'm interested in, is the spread of Christianity in Asia in
Oh,
ancient and medieval times.
oh,
And so I have an article I'm working on about the spread of Christianity in China. Um, I'm working with, I should mention, the Institute for Christian Reflection.
Yes,
And
yes.
if your listeners they've been supporting the book. And if your listeners are interested in learning more about my work or more about supporting the Institute as they support me and other scholars or other scholarship, they can visit their website. It's just the instituteforchristianreflection.org. We could perhaps give a link to that.
yeah,
Um,
we'll put it up. Yeah, that's
yes,
great.
so lots more to come, and keep their eyes open on that.
Okay,
All right. All right.
you wouldn't happen to know Richard Bauckham, would you?
I don't know him personally, but I've been meaning to reach out to him.
Yes, yeah, I really appreciate his first century analysis on the eyewitnesses of Jesus and so forth. And a friend of mine actually studied with him at Cambridge,
Hmm.
Doug with us. So anyway, someone to certainly touch base, doing the same kind of genre research that you've been doing. And I thought it would be helpful
Yes,
to cross paths.
his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, is fabulous.
It is, yeah. Yeah, great,
And
great.
and actually he was one of my inspirations for doing my social network analysis. I thought, there's all these names. Josephus has hundreds, thousands of names in his book. He knows so many people. I wonder if I can track down some people that he knew whom we also can place
Mhm.
at the trial of Jesus. And
Wow.
that's what I do in part 2 of my book. And I show, perhaps I can give a sneak peek to your listeners. Um,
Okay.
I show there's a number of candidates that are probable candidates for being at the trial of Jesus. But I think the most probable candidate is Josephus's commander in the Jewish war.
Mm.
And I'll explain a little bit about this. Our pieces of evidence for this are that, as I said, Josephus says it was the first men among us who accused Jesus. And then later on, he says that he knew the first men and he started continually meeting with them around 51 or 52 AD. And it's only simple logic to think that, well, 20 years after Jesus is crucified, you would think there would be some of the same first men still around 20 years
Right.
later. So it's obviously possible Josephus could have known them. And he doesn't just say it was the first men, he says the first men among us. And that phrase among us is peculiar to Josephus. He loves that phrase, he uses it a lot. And he seems to use it to mark, in part, it's not the only reason that he uses it, but every time he uses about 50 times that phrase among us. And he seems to mark a subject with which the speaker has direct personal knowledge.
Mm.
In other words, when he says the first men among us, he seems to be saying that I knew some of these guys who accused Jesus. Now, this isn't certain. There's of the 50 instances he uses the word, there's 3 of them where it's only maybe they knew the speaker knows the subject. But 47 out of 50 instances is pretty good odds. I go over all that in my book. And the candidate that I settle on for who he's talking about, what of these first men is he mentioning, is his commander, Ananus II. Ananus II was the supreme commander of the Jewish war effort. He had 7 generals under him, one of whom was Josephus, so Josephus knew him directly. And Ananus II was the brother-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest.
Mm.
And Ananus II, same guy, the commander, he was the son of Annas, the high priest, the
Mm.
other high priest at the trial of Jesus. He was the high priest emeritus at the trial of Jesus. And his son-in-law is Caiaphas, who's presiding over the trial. And both Luke and John mention Annas, and John mentions Annas specifically at the trial. And so here we have Josephus, whose personal acquaintance is the son and brother-in-law of the 2 high priests who had Jesus crucified. That's remarkable already.
It
And
is.
That would be quite the conversation over a dinner table.
That'd be
I
cool. That'd be
know,
fun. Yeah, this
I
is some cool
know,
stuff.
I know. And the question becomes, okay, but was his commander actually at the trial of Jesus? And I think the answer is,
Yeah.
I think so. I think he was. And this is not just, naked speculation. It comes from the fact that we know that his commander was extremely old in 68 AD. Josephus tells us that. So he clearly, about 40 years later, would have been an adult. He would have been an adult male. And the second reason, so he could have been at the trial. He would have been old enough. He was around when his father and brother-in-law put Jesus to trial. But the clincher is that Jesus was arrested on Passover.
Right.
And Jewish law in the Torah and in the Talmud and in the Mishnah require faithful Jews to go to Jerusalem and to celebrate Passover in their father's house, the
Right.
house of their father, their family patriarch. So Josephus' commander would have been in Jerusalem on the Passover in his father's house. And where was Jesus brought for trial?
Yep.
He was brought to trial in the house of Annas the high priest, who is the father of Josephus' commander, exactly when and exactly where Josephus' commander was required to have been
Right.
at that time, according to Jewish law. So I think that is the gentleman that Josephus was referring to when he said the first men among us accused Jesus. I think he's talking about his commander. I give 10 or 11 other candidates in my book, some of whom are it's very speculative for some of them, but a couple of them have some pretty good evidence behind as well.
Mm.
So I encourage your readers to check it out. They can get the book for free. A very generous donor came forward to make the book freely available to download. And you can get that at the book website, which is josephusandjesus.com.
Right. I'll make that available. I put a slide up for
Right.
that. Yeah. Fascinating.
Absolutely. That is
And
fascinating stuff. Wow.
there's more in the book. There's a reference there to probably Gamaliel, Paul's teacher, and some
Yes.
connections there that are quite fascinating. I love the logic, and you do a great job at connecting the dots, as we say. And
This is a wonderful
great,
puzzle being put together, no doubt.
yeah. So
Yeah.
you've done some great. As an archaeologist, I like it because it's kind of like detective work, and you're always trying to put the puzzle together and not making them fit, but excited when they do fit and see things coming together. So um, great job, Tom. Appreciate it.
Yeah. And you mentioned
Probably,
some people that there are artifacts that validate them, like the Caiaphas ossuaries in the Israel Museum. I
yep.
mean,
Yes.
yeah, he's mentioning these names, and of course I work with artifacts, and so the thing is rolling in my head. I'll go, oh, they got an artifact for that. And wow, that's really cool.
Yes.
We have
So
one of
wow,
the houses of the high priest that's excavated, the birdhouse in Jerusalem,
birdhouse.
if anybody's
Yes.
in Jerusalem. So there are artifacts that go along with this and help to solidify and the new pilgrim's path they've just excavated from the Temple Mount all the way down to the Siloam Pool. And they found some
Wow.
exciting excavations. We've done a couple of podcasts on that.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of history that comes together, and Josephus helps us to get a firsthand account of what things were like from a general's perspective and from a Jew. Now, he was both Roman and Jew, so he's sort of playing both sides of the fence and seeing things from both sides. So he has a real unique perspective on things, I think, and as you seem to point out, he seems to be more um, sort of neutral than he is pro and con.
Yeah.
Precisely. Yeah.
That's interesting because you think where Jesus being in Nazareth, and some would speculate because his family were tectons or masons that they would have went to Sepphoris to work, and Sepphoris was basically a Jewish Gentile city. You can almost divide it in half by the archaeology, and there is a tradition that at Sepphoris is the ruins of the house of Mary, the mother of Jesus. So
Oh.
yeah, so I think you
Hmm.
could actually visit. I think they might have something fairly, I'll just say simple, like a stone or a structure that's supposed to be a remnant of her family domicile, I'll put it that way. And
Okay.
so there is a strong tradition there as well. So this has been fascinating and fun. And the more you talk, the more things are flashing through my mind of places I visited in Jerusalem, such as the Wall Museum and at Israel Museum as well, and the artifacts there. And what a giveaway. People, one thing, okay, you 330,000 subscribers out there. This is your chance. Come on. You can support a nice ministry, the works that he's doing. Also, pick up this book. I'm telling you, I went through it. It's very fascinating, and it brings about so many questions that leads into so many questions. And actually, it's a lot of fun. It's just a lot of fun.
Well,
So,
thanks, Tom. Appreciate it very much. You coming on the
yes,
podcast and sharing your enthusiasm and a new discovery of Josephus and his contributions to the life of Jesus and how important that is for us as scholars.
absolutely.
George,
Doctor, thank
David,
you for
thanks
your
for having
time.
me on.
Yeah,
This
you're
has been
welcome.
this has been a lot of fun. Thank you very much for your time. Everybody out there, thanks for joining us. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to like and subscribe, and we will see you again next week. Thank you very much.